Thank you for joining us for today's presentation, Prevent a Data Breach with our 10 Hands-On Solutions, featuring our speaker for today, Christian Kelly. Christian, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, and thanks for everyone who's joined the webinar. My name is Christian Kelly. I'm the CTO here at Xantreon, and I've worked in the technology and security industry for a number of years. And here at Xantreon, I work specifically with our operations team and our security NOC and SOC centers to design the security solutions for our clients and to monitor and react to incidences that arise. So again, very happy to be here, and thank you for joining us this morning. This is our first polling question. We have a few of these throughout the webinar here. The question here is, do you sense an increase of cybersecurity threats this year versus last? And I think our perspective is yes. It will be interesting to see what those who are on the call think. I think we'll get those results up here in a few minutes. But from our perspective, again, Xantreon has seen an uptick, and yeah, looking at the results here, it seems like that's something that you all are seeing as well. I think when we look at kind of the cyber threat landscape, we definitely are seeing more attacks, more angles that attackers are taking to try to compromise systems, and keeping our defenses up and reacting to those attacks is something that we obviously think about a lot. So moving here to the next slide, we wanted to start with giving a couple examples, real-world examples of things that we've seen in the last 12 months, incidents that we've been involved in. I'll kind of walk through a few. I think these types of things are always interesting for perspective. Starting off, we worked this year with a manufacturing firm. This firm was completely crypto lockered when we engaged. They had, they didn't have very good security controls. They're a manufacturing firm, which tend to lag a little bit in kind of the technology and security controls. And we saw a complete crypto locker for all servers. They had some cloud services as well that were impacted, and all of their endpoints. This company was essentially dead in the water. Thankfully, the one saving fact was they did have good cloud-based backups, so we were able to bring all of that data back. However, it did take quite some time. There was a lot of data to restore. We had to rebuild the systems from scratch. So all servers, all endpoints, everything new from scratch, because when you have one of those types of compromises, it's not just the fact of getting your data back. You have to be sure that the attackers are not still in your network with persistence. So that was a complete rebuild, big impact to their sales and production. A similar thing with a smaller client as well, similar security measures in place, not very strong. Also a complete crypto locker. So that was another complete rebuild. And I think this year, or over these last 12 months, this is the first time that we've had full rebuilds of environments due to this type of attack. Another type of compromise we've been dealing with, for quite some time, but it continues to get worse, is that kind of email account man-in-the-middle compromise that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, where an attacker kind of infiltrates into the email and kind of man in the middle is a conversation. This was a lending firm, so again, was able to get in between a conversation and have a lot of money wired to a independent account that they were able to get a hold of those funds. So that's more common that we've seen over time, but again, it's been ramping up. Another kind of clever attack we saw recently was a new HR representative joined a company, and we suspect that through LinkedIn, the attackers were able to glean that information and work out kind of a trick, a spoofed email. This wasn't a full account compromise, but kind of a spoofed email that asked to redirect a paycheck to another a bank number, and that went through, and a paycheck or two went through. So again, we're seeing the similar attacks, but they're just kind of amped up and ramped up. A 2019 FBI crime report said that about 2 billion emails, $2 billion were exfiltrated simply by asking for it. So this isn't necessarily a crypto locker type of event, but just account compromise and requesting funds, redirecting funds. So that's an alarming number. And a report from Sophos, which is a security company, they did a poll and for their client base, and 21% of businesses over the last year have experienced some form of ransomware attack, either a complete company crypto locker or kind of an isolated crypto locker event. So that again is quite a high number if you think about it, 21%. And another thing we're seeing is the attackers are getting really smart about how they ask for the money and how much they ask for. So we're not seeing this kind of blanket attack where they crypto locker and just ask for a few $1,000s. We're seeing more persistent attacks where they get in and they really look around and they don't really kick off that attack until they understand where the backups are, they understand kind of the profile of the company, who they're dealing with, and then they target a number that they feel is payable. It's not too high, not too low. So they're kind of really going through the effort to understand how much money they can ask for and what will be a reasonable amount. We're seeing this with school systems, private equity. We're seeing it all over the place, where again the ask is based off of the revenue of the company or the expected, the expected amount that they think they can get. So they're really starting to get smart. Which brings us to our next polling questions before we get into kind of the controls and the remediation efforts here. So this polling question is, what type of cybercrime have you been most concerned about in the last 12 months? Denial of service type attacks, funds transfer fraud, ransomware, or theft of sensitive data. And some of these kind of overlap a little bit. Ransomware can kind of be construed as a type of denial of service attack, but again, interested in what people are seeing, what people are most concerned with. So when the results come in, we can take a quick look there. And then we'll move into the top 10 solutions. We ran a poll and got some interesting data back. So again, here we're looking at this: funds transfer fraud and ransomware, theft of sensitive data all have hits. So that's interesting. But yeah, we also feel that fund transfer fraud angle is definitely more prevalent. It's less disruptive than a ransomware, but it definitely happens more often. And there's some great controls that you can put in place to bring that the possibility of that down. So moving on here, here we're going to talk a little bit about what we feel are controls and technologies that you can put in place that will help prevent the breach of these types of data breaches. Obviously, there's no silver bullet. There's no guarantee that if you do X, Y is not going to happen. But as you amp up your controls and your technologies, it reduces the likelihood that you will be a victim of these types of attacks. So moving to number one, we feel multi-factor authentication is at this point pretty much table stakes. Most people have multi-factor in place. Most of our clients do, and we suspect that it's something that's on everyone's roadmap, if not already implemented. Microsoft did a study that we thought was really telling about accounts that were compromised kind of over a period of time. I guess this was in January, in 1 month. So again, the ratio is incredible, adding multi-factor versus without multi-factor. And we've seen the same. Most of the compromises that we've seen have been with clients or accounts without multi-factor. It's not impossible to have an account compromised with multi-factor, but it's exponentially more difficult. So we feel that this is one of the best and easiest ways to prevent all sorts of attacks. One thing to note that we've seen is make sure that you get your multi-factor wrapped around all of your critical data. So we have seen instances where companies have put in multi-factor, for example, in Office 365, yet not gone all the way through to the end in disabling kind of the legacy protocols that don't require multi-factor. So there's ways you can turn multi-factor on without completely disabling the old methods of access. So be cognizant of that and really make sure that you go through and disable any form of authentic, the old authentication that wouldn't require it. Another thing to consider is all of your, again, I mentioned all of your critical data. We've seen where multi-factor, it's always good to put multi-factor in place, but be aware that if you put multi-factor in your email, that you really also need it on your VPN, on your remote desktop, if you have SaaS services, that again, you covered and blanketed all your critical data with that multi-factor. So that's something to keep in mind, and something that's a little harder to do, but definitely worth going after. Which moves us to kind of our second, our number 2 here is single sign-on. This is something, again, I think most people are slowly moving to. We are big proponents of single sign-on for both ease of use for the end user. They have, kind of one identity, and they can go and access all of their SaaS and local applications. It's step by step to get there. It's not, you can't just flip the switch and have everything flipped to single sign-on. Some older applications don't support it, but we really march towards trying to get everything under single sign-on that's possible. I mean, it really kind of goes to our identity protection and kind of really focusing around the identity, which multi-factor and single sign-on really help you control and understand that identity. A side product of having single sign-on in with a provider like Azure AD is you get really good auditing controls of like what users are doing when they're logging in and where they're logging in from. It can give you lots of telemetry around, even if you have multi-factor, if there's attempted account compromise via, where people are logging in from and how often they're logging in. A lot of data can be gathered and analyzed, and it's a very powerful tool. So we're, again, protecting that identity. We feel having a single source of that identity through a product like Azure AD or some form of central cloud identity and wrapping in all of your SaaS-based applications, that is very important. So and then that moves us on to, there are those applications which can't be wrapped under SSO because they're not SAML compliant, or there's some reason, and so there we like to see a strong password manager in place, something like LastPass or Keeper. Again, we like that password manager to be tied in to the single source, the single sign-on provider, multi-factor, of course, but then you can hit those websites that might not be fully compliant for a single sign-on kind of implementation. We see this a lot with financial firms, RIAs, which might have, a lot of bank usernames and passwords for their clients, or, just things that can't be wrapped in. So again, a password manager is great. Having a corporate password manager, we feel, is an important step, not allowing people to just be running their own password managers, again, because these usernames and passwords are really corporate assets, and you need to be able to audit them and change them if needed. If an employee is terminated, again, you want to be able to disable that one account and have that flow through all of your single sign-on, your password manager, be able to understand what passwords you might need to change. So again, we feel this, again, continues to wrap around that identity, right? You get that single source of truth around identity, you get multi-factor, you get single sign-on, you have password manager, and that really helps kind of round out the identity and controls and security around authentication. And that moves us to our next one, number 4, which is kind of phishing, kind of training concepts. We think that you do everything you can to protect the identity, and then you kind of have to move to the user and really give the user the tools that they need to understand how they may be attacked individually. We had a case just a couple weeks ago where a law firm was, hit with one of those typical, cards. Go to Walgreens and buy a bunch of iTunes or eBay cards, which you would think at this point no one would fall for. But again, it was supposedly coming from the partner, the main leading partner of the firm, and he went out and got these cards and sent them off. And thankfully, it wasn't a huge amount of funds, but still, it goes back to the need for that end user training, right? So you can use a platform that can do phish testing with remedial training, but beyond that, just having some form of regular training is really important for your end users, because again, most of these attacks come through kind of the vector of the users, whether it's through phishing or kind of a direct contact mechanism. Training the users is a really important thing, and we definitely see, when we start these types of trainings, we definitely see a reduction of kind of interaction with those emails. So we're able to track, when we send that first phishing email blast out, how many people interact with it, how many people actually give up their usernames and passwords down, over the months. We definitely see a reduction in that. So that's meaningful. That's meaningful training for end users. Which leads us to our third quick polling question here, which is, how do you see your use of external cybersecurity vendors changing in the coming year? So, we always see that kind of partnership with vendors as being something that companies are always evaluating. Whether they're using more in-house resources or more external vendors. We see larger firms and companies being able to have the resources to train internal resources and keep them on staff and motivated. But we see a lot of the smaller firms needing to outsource that. So that's it's just an interesting question that we like to see how others are thinking of. But typically we see the benefits on both sides here. Yeah, so that kind of trends to what we see out there, which is typically again in kind of the SMB and mid-sized space, using external resources more. All right, so that moves us here to number 5, which is around data encryption. This is something most people have in play, some type of encryption going on. With mobile devices, iPhones, iPads, those types of mobile devices, it's starting to get really easy because those are encrypted by default typically. Most Androids and iPhones nowadays kind of come out of the box with pretty strong encryption baked in. Endpoints, laptops, Macs, those are still kind of in that area where you definitely need to have some controls and some management. We see that as being kind of the gap where you really have to have a good sound policy around how you're encrypting your endpoints. Most companies are using some kind of technology like BitLocker, which is great, but one thing that we've seen that's difficult, that's a little more difficult than just having a policy and turning it on, is really being able to audit that over time. Because again, if an endpoint gets stolen or lost with critical data on it and sensitive data, having some kind of way to understand and know that that computer indeed was encrypted at a recent point in time is something that's important and has a lot to do with whether you might have a reporting requirement around that incident. So again, being able to go back and say, oh, yesterday this computer was online and indeed we have proof that it was encrypted, essentially makes that a non-event. Whereas if you don't have something in place, you kind of have to assume that your policy was in play and that computer wasn't somehow unencrypted for whatever reason, for some kind of BIOS update or something like that. So again, having a good sound policy is important, following that policy is important, and also having some kind of audit mechanism in place to be able to definitively point to a trail that says, yes, indeed, that we have proof that that computer was encrypted is very important. Obviously, fines can be levied for different types of data that might be lost. I mean, there's some examples here up on the screen, especially around companies with HIPAA information or financial information. It's definitely something you want to take into consideration. All right, so moving to our sixth topic here. Here we've got the internal security policies and risk assessments. This is something we really like to see companies have a very strong policy framework and procedures in place. A lot of companies have a lot of technical controls in place, but not a good tying document that really explains the security program and the security policies. We find that going through this exercise typically brings in a lot of CX level discussions, which is great to kind of get that visibility up the org chart and just high level decisions made. And once that document is created and decided on, we find that it really helps answer a lot of future technology or operational questions where you can kind of point back to the document and say, this is our policy, therefore we can or we can't do X, right? If you're bringing in a new vendor or you're bringing in a new technology, you can find, pretty quickly if it conforms to the policies and procedures that you have put into place. Not to say that you would never change it or review it. A good security policies and documents typically gone over at least annually and updated. But having that in place can reduce the likelihood of both costly penalties and also missing something or having a gap in your security controls. So again, some examples here up on the screen that have to do with firms that have HIPAA data or GDPR, where the lack of a good policy and following that policy resulted in fines. Which brings up another topic of if you do have a security policy, you really need to make sure that you're able to follow it. So we like to see, don't go too far out ahead of you of what you're able to do in your policy. Be very careful that if you say, we encrypt all our endpoints, or we encrypt everything, that you again have good auditable controls to follow it. Because if it's found that you don't follow your own security policy, that can almost be worse than not having a policy at all. So again, there's that balance. Really make sure you have a good policy and you're able to follow it. Don't be too aggressive in your policy or make claims that you can't follow through on. All right, and that takes us here to number 7, which we look at around kind of controlling the endpoint. So stepping back, I talked about securing the identity as being one of the prime kind of candidates or prime controls in this new kind of cloud era where we don't have perimeters around our networks anymore, right? We really care about the identity of the user, about the user themselves, training the user. And then the next most important thing is really controlling and protecting that endpoint, right? So we want to see multiple layers of technology on an endpoint, right? Not necessarily relying on a single, kind of legacy antivirus product. We want to see, possibly an EDR solution in there, which are kind of modern, endpoint detection and response capabilities with logging. We want to see, some kind of internet filtering technology, because again, you may have had a firewall in the past that did internet filtering for you. That doesn't really work anymore as people are working from home or people are working from, wherever, Starbucks. You need to be able to have those same kind of enterprise controls and protections down at the endpoint level. Again, not to say that you don't need to protect any networks or there's never a reason to do that anymore, but going forward, as more and more services are exiting the perimeter of the network and moving to cloud services, that perimeter of protection is less important, and moving those protections and those controls out to the endpoints are becoming more and more critical. So again, protecting the identity of the user, protecting the user themselves, and protecting the endpoint are all key pillars in what we see as kind of a strong cybersecurity framework for this new modern era where most of the data and services that we're using are cloud-based. All right, so moving on to number 8, and this is one that is pretty common. It's been something we've been dealing with for decades now, which is around security patching. Unfortunately, it continues to be a difficult problem to truly solve. We've seen a lot of cases where you have a patching program in place, obviously, but how are you really defining whether those patches are actually happening and your servers and your endpoints are actually secure? We are finding that just relying on a single data source to both patch and report on the patching is not always the best strategy, right? So if you have some kind of patching product out there that's in charge of the patching and reporting whether those patchings are working, we've seen lots of cases where whatever product you may be using, and none of them are perfect, might say, hey, this endpoint's patched when really it hasn't been patched in a year. And it's just because the patching engine might be broken or the patching mechanism might be broken, something's wrong with the endpoint, and it's essentially reporting a false positive. So having a mechanism to both have reliable patching on a schedule is very important, but also being able to report on that patching kind of independently from the mechanism. So that can be solved with some kind of vulnerability management software, that kind of a third-party check. It can be done with scripting and automation. There's lots of ways to solve that, but we like to see a strong patching program in place that handles both system level patching and application patching, which is even more difficult to do. But kind of following those reports of vulnerabilities that come out and really making sure that you have a good program that's relatively quick to remediate them, and then has some kind of third-party check to make sure that indeed all of the systems are patched and there isn't a gap in your patching. We saw recently with the Windows Active Directory zero login flaw. That was one that you really want to jump on quick and, again, really definitively know that you're not vulnerable to that. We've seen attacks. We actually saw a report with a ransomware attack where I think they said within about 50 minutes of infiltration with zero login, they were able to get on the domain controllers, get complete domain control over an environment, and do a crypto locker within 50 minutes of initial infiltration, which is obviously very short. Normally, there's a methodical process where they have to move laterally to gain privileges, and it gives you chances to catch those lateral movements with breach detection tools that may be in place. But if you have something like an unpatched system with something as critical as zero login, that can happen so quickly that you don't even have a chance to react to that type of attack. So we think obviously patching is very important. Okay, moving on to 9 here, our 9th topic, vendor security assessments. This is something that really should be a framework and a policy that comes out of your security policy, right? Your security policy should dictate what your vendor due diligence kind of profile and what's required in those assessments. But we think that most companies should have some form of vendor due diligence assessments taking place for their third-party vendors. It really starts with understanding what your critical data is. You need to define what it is, because if a vendor isn't touching your critical data, in this day and age with so many SaaS services, you need to be able to quickly identify whether a vendor is going to fall under the umbrella of needing to be assessed. So the first step is understanding what type of data classifications you might have in your company, and then when a vendor intersects with the data, typically a vendor due diligence package is needed. And typically people will use a third party for this, but being able to reach out to the vendor, understand what their policies and procedures are, if they have any ISO or SOC attestations that you can look at, can be very revealing. We like to see and do this as early in the kind of acquisition process as possible for a new service. So the best time to be doing vendor due diligence assessments is when you're evaluating a new product, right? Again, SaaS products are constantly flowing into companies, sometimes through shadow IT with users just going out there and signing up for things. But again, if you can have this framework in place to perform these assessments, the best time to do it is when you're trying to decide which of these 2 or 3 products do we want to use, where you're not only looking at feature sets and capabilities, but you're also looking at kind of the maturity of the security of these companies, which can be very telling, again, about the likely long-term ability for that vendor to stay in business. Typically we see the stronger vendors having, already thought about and having really good controls in place, where kind of the more startup companies might not have the frameworks in place needed. And that can flow through to whether, again, the client, the vendors have single sign-on and other capabilities that you might, work into the decision matrix of whether you're going to go with company A or company B. So having a good, sound security assessment capability, whether you've identified a vendor to do it for you or you have some kind of internal capability to do that, we feel as being a very good piece of a security program and practice. Which leads us to the last topic here, which is mobile device or mobile application management. We, the kind of over the last few years, the technology has grown in this area, and it's actually made it easier for a company to deal with the bring your own device scenario, because that's clearly something that, over time, very few people want to carry around 2 phones, right? A company phone and a private phone. I would say 95% or more of the clients that we deal with have a single bring your own device type phone policy in place. Some companies still will, pay for or, actually give a phone. But most companies have moved to models where they might pay a stipend for, the phone plan. But again, the phone is under the control and kind of is the property of the end user. So then as you try to understand how to protect corporate data, the traditional approach over the years has been MDM, mobile device management, where again, you're kind of hooking in at the device level. Once you hook in at that level, whether you like it or not, the company kind of has a lot of control over the phone, which the users don't really like and can push back on, right? Where you could, if an employee left, the employer could theoretically wipe the phone, which could wipe photos and contacts and things of that nature. So thankfully, the platform that we use, and I'm sure a lot of you use, is the Microsoft platform stack. And Microsoft came out with a concept of mobile application management, which again, you can wrap those same policies around. The data must be encrypted, there must be pins, it must be wipeable. You can't copy data from a corporate app to a non-corporate app. All of those controls and policies can be put into place at the application level. So again, you're wrapping that security around the applications and not the device, which is kind of the best of both worlds, where now if an employee is terminated or exits, you're able to wipe your corporate data, leaving the phone intact for the end user. And the reason, again, this works in kind of the Microsoft ecosystem is because all of the applications that people are using on a day-to-day basis, Outlook, Teams, OneDrive, Excel, all of those apps are Microsoft apps that users want to use. A lot of other MDM technology companies kind of tried to move into this managed apps, but again, no one wants to use the third party's version of Word or a third party's version of Outlook, right? So it kind of, for those of us who are kind of in the Microsoft ecosystem and platform, this has been a really easy transition to go towards, because again, the users are already using the apps. They like the apps. We can control the apps, and it makes a very compelling story from a security and compliance perspective from the company, and from a user not having to give up kind of privacy or control on their personal device. So that's been a really nice technology play that's really come forward in the last year or two from Microsoft. Okay, so moving, I thought this was an interesting slide to show. So we did a survey for a bunch of companies, and we got this data back. And some of this was a little bit surprising to me, but kind of going over the top 10 things we just talked about, this was a percentage of firms that were currently employing one of these types of technologies. So again, a lot of people have some form of device management in play, some encryption in play, internet filtering. I was surprised that multi-factor was just at 50%. I would have suspected at this point that number would have been higher. I think that's probably the biggest opportunity for anyone who really wants to ratchet up, especially that business email compromise, account compromise type of attack. I again would point to multi-factor as being the easiest thing to go after to really close down that hole. Security awareness training, kind of moving down the list. I was surprised that patch management was so low. I don't know if that meant more of a managed patch solution versus just letting things patch on their own, or what. Single sign-on was pretty low. And again, I feel like people are, kind of dealing with the multi-factor and getting their core identity set. That's kind of a curve that we see where a client will move towards getting multi-factor in place and really getting the identity sorted out, and then we'll start layering on a single sign-on one at a time, starting with their most critical applications and data, and moving forward. So that's kind of a trend that we're seeing. But I thought this was kind of interesting data for people, and interesting for people to see kind of maybe where they're at as it relates to what others are doing. So that was interesting. So we're kind of wrapping up. We've moved through this pretty quickly. But there will be time for questions. If anyone does have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end here. But kind of going back to kind of our holistic approach around security, and I've gone over this a few times, again, is starting with the identity of your users. We feel this is vital, really getting a handle of how people are logging in, what identity they're using, what usernames and passwords. Really try to stay away from multiple identities where people are having to remember different usernames and passwords for different services, because again, that leads to people writing usernames and passwords down, saving them in their email, just having bad kind of user training due to the fact that they don't have a single identity that they can use for work. So we see that as being really important. And then kind of going down to the securing the endpoints, we also feel that's vital. Getting multiple layers of protection, getting visibility, some kind of breach detection capabilities on endpoints. And then something that we didn't really go over in this, but is also obviously important, is protecting the sensitive information. There's a lot of technologies that, again, can come into play here. Obviously, the encryption of endpoints is a way, but going beyond that, as you kind of solve some of these other easier problems, understanding what data is most critical, and then figuring out how to wrap extra protection and encryption around the actual data that you're trying to protect, is something that we see companies that are kind of further down the curve or further down the line of their kind of security roadmap. Once these other types of controls are in place, people start really thinking about, well, how do I want to protect the data independently from where it might live, right? So again, when your data moves to the cloud, into a SharePoint library or Box or whatever, do you want to start applying controls at the data, at the sensitive information itself, whether it's documents, Excel files, what have you? There are technologies out there like information rights management where you can say, only this group can access this data, and they must be online and authenticated. So again, if someone exfiltrates the data on a USB stick and sends it to someone else, they can't open it. And again, that's further down the road. That technology really only comes into play when a lot of other things are done and in place. But it's definitely out there, and something that we're starting to think about, and we're starting to engage with our clients on as they, again, get more and more maturity around their security process. Okay, so moving, I think this is our final polling question, and then we are at this point. That's the end of the presentation. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to chat them, and we can go over them. Yeah, that's the official end of our presentation here. And I guess if we have any questions, do you want to, if there are any questions, do you want to start reading them out?
Sure. I'll close this poll and then we can get to the Q&A.
Excellent, thank you.
And by the way, here are the results of that poll.
Yep, and that's not surprising. I think one interesting thing is, as people look to increase their spend or to increase the technologies that they might have around security, in this last year with everything that's happened, in some cases they're reallocating budgets that other types of technology spend into security. So we're seeing that kind of reallocation take place where there might not be extra funds for security necessarily, but clients will start figuring out ways where the importance of security is really ramping up in people's minds. So they're finding ways to get the controls in place that are needed.
Great. So we do have a couple of questions here. The first one is, why do smaller firms tend to rely on third-party security resources?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think we've seen smaller firms needing to rely on third parties for many things. I think the concept of using third parties to handle operations that can't be staffed and trained internally is something that we're seeing kind of a trend, even outside of the technology arena. We see a lot of companies moving to outside accountants and all sorts of services that come into play. Having a fully staffed security capability, having security personnel and security capabilities staffed at your company is a difficult proposition. Security staff are expensive, and training them and keeping them engaged and motivated is a difficult thing to do. And unless you're a larger enterprise that has that capability, it's tough to, again, retain that staff and keep them motivated, keep them trained, keep them engaged. And so, we do see things of that nature moving towards external firms more and more.
And as a second question to that, what is a typical security budget for a smaller firm?
That's a good question. I think firms, everyone has a different risk profile, and so I would start the kind of conversation and question around what are the assets you're trying to protect and what's the risk that you're trying to protect from, and then it's going to be some portion of that risk that you're going to be willing to spend to mitigate it. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach here. I think that you've got to be careful that you don't overspend, right? Just as careful as you are that you're not underspending on a technology play. But again, understanding the risk, whether it's the risk to your clients, what kind of risk, intrinsic risk there is to you as a company through different types of attacks can help inform how much you should spend and how much you're willing to spend. And of course, that also, segues into understanding, it's not something we touched on, but understanding you really understand your insurance, what they are going to cover, what they're not going to cover. I touched on that big compromise we dealt with early in the webinar, where again, it was like a $250,000 that this company needed to spend to kind of get back on its feet. And when we engaged early on, they didn't know what their insurance would or would not cover, which is something I feel like those conversations should happen ahead of time, where the phone is picked up and a conversation is had on what happens if this type of attack happens or this type of situation happens. It's good to know those things going forward, but mitigating the cost with good insurance is definitely something that a company should be well aware of and well protected by having a good policy in place for that.
Great, thank you. Before I get to the next question, there is a poll showing on the screen right now. Should you have any questions that you'd like to speak to somebody about, or would like some more information about the services here today, just answer one of these, check one of these items, and we'll follow up with you directly. The next question I have on the questions panel is, what are your top tips for building a security team?
Building a security team, I think I think it starts with the top, right? Having a good leader in place or good leadership in place, making it a priority, and then training, training people. We've built a very strong security team. We have a few key personnel that really run that portion of our business, but kind of bringing staff in and getting them trained up is a big piece of what we do. We like to bring people up within the organization. So there's a lot of there's training that takes place. I think most individuals in technology kind of are starting to gravitate towards security because it's such a big piece of what we do today. So there's definitely a lot of interest there. So having some key personnel at the top is important, and then training up from within has been a key success for us, and I feel it would be the same for others.
Oh, great, thank you very much. So the next question that we have that came in is, what are new security technologies that you're keeping your eye on?
I think new security technologies. So I think that the EDR space is definitely interesting for us. We've evaluated a bunch of those technologies, and there's some really good stuff out there, especially around the being able to log and understand, kind of scenarios as they're happening, or once a scenario happens once, being able to see if that same kind of attack is happening in other locations. So that kind of visibility into those attacks is definitely interesting. I think another angle is, as people move to cloud technologies and more to serverless infrastructure, we're starting to see security technology that is less about a single server or a single instance that you might put an agent on or worry about, and more about how the service is being interacted with and used. And so kind of API based, like being able to pull all that information in from your different APIs, gather it together, and have playbooks, and being able to run incidences off of those different types of alerting. The things are really starting to flatten out, and the services that are being used are starting to get broader and broader, right? So before, where you might have had a single file server and you worried about access, you might have Azure files or something on Amazon blob storage, and you're having to understand, are these open to the outside world? Are they authenticating correctly? Who's accessing them? Are there alerts around these kind of serverless pieces? So again, being able to hook in and pull all of that data together has been a very interesting problem that we've been solving and working on, and then being able to turn that into actionable data, into an incident where we can respond, is something that we've been putting a lot of time and focus into over the last 6 months, and I think that will go on through the next year as we continue to fine tune that. So those are some of the technologies that we've been looking at.
Great. I think we have a couple minutes left. We have a couple more questions here. The first one is, what are your suggestions for building a strong security culture in an organization?
I think it goes back to really having a good security policy and framework in place that's actually readable and understandable, and that is trained on, so that employees understand the importance of it. So we have a policy, policies and procedures in place, obviously, and it's something that we get in front of our employees regularly. We actually train on, so it's not just read this policy and sign your name annually for any changes, but it's people read the policy, and then there's questions that come after it. We put that into a learning kind of management system that we're able to track. I think it really comes from the top. It's something that has to be pushed from the CEO down, and that the importance of the policies and procedures has to be stressed to end users, or else it just is this document that you signed when you started 3 years ago and you really haven't looked at or dealt with. So bringing that to the forefront of employees on a regular basis, I think, is something that's important for us. Obviously, we go through an annual attestation process where we have auditors that come in, and so I think it's easier when you have something like that in place. It's something that's always in the back of your mind and that you're focused on, and so I think that permeates out through the organization. But where you don't have that requirement, or you haven't put yourself through that type of audit, I think just a regular cadence of getting eyeballs on it, doing some training around it, and really helping employees understand how important it is to the long-term success of the organization is something that is definitely helpful.
Great, thank you very much. Another one here is, what are the top things you look at when you do a security assessment?
So the type of security, so when there's two types of security assessments that we do. Obviously, we look at clients, maybe prospect clients or our own clients, and we try to stick to the common kind of frameworks that are out there, whether it's the NIST framework or the Common Control Set framework, where we'll map out kind of best practices. A lot of the things that were on this list and others would be ways that we would understand how a company that we might work with in the future is, and kind of help map that roadmap to controls that should be put in place and things that should be done. And then another type of assessment we do is obviously like a vendor due diligence package. We don't do a huge amount of those because it's time consuming, and there are other vendors that do them as well. But that type of assessment, we're really looking more towards reports, what kind of SOC information they have, whether we can review it. We might have like a questionnaire that we send out with a lot of common questions. But again, we try to stick to commonly understood frameworks to map these things out. Our internal and our managed security program that we bring to our clients is very closely aligned with what you would see in kind of a mapping to a NIST framework or something like that. So our philosophy around how we interact with our clients specifically is we want to hit the majors first, and we want to bring meaningful change. We don't just want to bring in technology for technology's sake. So we'll obviously multi-factor would be, if it's not in place, one of the first things that we would try to do, and we would just try to edge them up slowly. And in a lot of cases, we are also kind of dealing with the impact, the end user impact. So we try to be very cognizant of that, where we don't try to put in too many controls where users are just frustrated, right? Because that's not where we want to be. We try to have a good balance between security and operations. We don't want to get in the middle of business. We don't want to impact business too greatly, but we want to have a good level of security and control in there. So it's a balancing act. I mean, I think we kind of hit that at a pretty good rate. We don't have clients generally pushing back on us too hard. There is elements though where you get the CEO who doesn't want to be in multi-factor, and you kind of have to work through that. But in the end, I feel like a good balance is needed, and we're able to achieve that.
Great, thank you. And one last question before we sign off is, how do you handle a data breach?
Yes, so that's a great question. It depends on the type, but for example, where we've dealt with, so to handle, there's lots of different types of data breaches, but the more common one that people are kind of cognizant and thinking of today is the crypto style attack, where they come in crypto and then a lot of times now they're exfiltrating the data. So not only do they have a pay us to get your data back, but it's also pay us to not release it. In those types of attacks, you kind of have to clean slate it. It's very difficult to, the common reaction is to, okay, well, let's go back a couple days from our backups and restore from there, because it's a simpler thing to do. But once someone's been in the network, it's very tough to say definitively that you've, closed all the holes, that that there's not a persistent threat in there in any way, shape, or form. So in those types of breaches, we're typically rebuilding. And that's as I've said, that's a very expensive, very disruptive operation. But I would say, make sure you have your insurance in place, and typically that comes with some form of kind of a breach coach. So typically we're one of the parties involved in these decisions, but we're not the only party involved. When there's a breach and when the company is trying to understand the risk and how to mitigate, a technology company like Xantron will be a voice in the room, and obviously an active participant in whatever is decided. But it's not just up to us, and it's not just typically even up to us and the client. Usually there's lawyers involved, insurance people involved, and a decision is made around the scope of what was likely to have happened. Maybe there is some proof of what happened, but even definitive proof of exfiltration of data in a crypto locker type of event is sometimes difficult to do if the right logging is in place, and if the right mechanisms aren't in place to actually understand what happened. So it's usually a bunch of people that are making that decision, and there's almost always lawyers involved, which I think is good. So make sure you understand who that team would be. It's great to do like a tabletop exercise where you might, kind of role play it out and understand, okay, who is it that we're calling? Who's in the room? Insurance companies are typically happy to engage in that, because I think they feel like if a company is engaging in that type of behavior, they're going to be less likely to make a claim, which I think insurance companies like. So, know who you're calling, know what your incident response plans are, and try to work through some of the common scenarios.
Great. Thank you very much for answering all of these questions. Again, thank you to the audience for joining us today. Here's some contact information should you have any further questions for Christian. And then I'd also like to thank Christian. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Absolutely. My contact information is up here. If anybody would like to contact me directly, please feel free.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Have a great day, everyone.